I'm going to tell you the darkest story the book of Genesis ever recorded. An entire city, every man, from the youngest to the oldest, marching toward a single house with a single intention. And what they shouted that night, 4,000 years ago, was so brutal that heaven itself came down to confirm it. Sodom, you were taught it fell because of one sin. That's a lie. It fell because of 5. And the first one, the very first one, is going to make you uncomfortable because it's happening right now in your own city. You were taught the problem was what they tried to do to 2 visitors. That's a lie. The problem started 4 centuries earlier, in a daily decision any of us could make without thinking. And you were taught archaeology never confirmed anything. That's also a lie. In the year 2021, a team of geologists published something in a journal of the Nature Group that changed the conversation forever. I'll show you in minute 22. Today you'll learn 3 things nobody told you. Why Sodom was labeled as the most extreme depravity any biblical text ever described. Why chapter 19 of Genesis isn't the story of a crime, but the story of a culture. And why the most disturbing moment of the account, the one almost no one preaches, didn't happen inside Sodom. It happened afterward, in a cave with 2 daughters. And you're going to understand why. If you make it to minute 42, there's a detail that connects everything, a detail modern sociologists have already named, a detail that lives in any social media feed, and a detail you probably saw today and didn't give any importance to. If this has already touched something inside you, drop a quick like. It's the only thing that tells the algorithm these topics matter, and it's what allows us to keep going. Sodom wasn't a city, it was a process. And that process has 5 steps. About 4,000 years ago, in the eastern region of the Dead Sea, there was a prosperous metropolis. And that metropolis had a problem. The problem wasn't poverty, quite the opposite. The Genesis text in chapter 13, verse 10, describes the Jordan region as well-watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. It was a fertile plain where commerce flowed and harvests came in almost on their own. But before we go further, there's a word you need to know. A Hebrew word that opens the whole story, because when we get to chapter 18, God himself speaks to Abraham and says something that has to shake you. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous. Look closely. There's a word in that text that almost every translation flattens. The word is zikar. And zikar doesn't mean fame or reputation. It literally means the cry of the victim. It's the same word that appears in Exodus chapter 2, verse 23, when the children of Israel cry out under Egyptian oppression. It's the same word that appears in Genesis chapter 4, verse 10, when the blood of Abel cries out from the ground. Ze'akah isn't social noise. It's the wail of someone being destroyed. Do you see the implication? What God is actually saying to Abraham is this. Something is happening in Sodom that's making its victims scream until their voices reach heaven. I, God says, am going down to see if everything reported up here is true. We're not talking about strangers lost on a street. The victims were so many, and the crimes were so systematic that all of heaven was hearing the screams. And that single detail, that detail alone, already changes the whole reading. Because most sermons focus on what the people of Sodom did, but the Hebrew text, in its origin, focuses on what their victims suffered. And we haven't even reached chapter 19 yet. Here's a question you may have never asked yourself. When exactly did Sodom become Sodom? Cities aren't born depraved. People aren't born wanting to rape angels. There was a process. There were generations. There were decisions. There were complicit silences. There were fathers who saw their sons do things and said nothing. There were judges who took bribes. There were women who learned not to walk alone at night. There were strangers who disappeared, and nobody asked where they'd gone. Sodom wasn't an event. Sodom was a social construction. And to understand how that happened, we have to go to the prophet Ezekiel. Because Ezekiel, writing almost 1,000 years later, does something no other biblical author does. He performs a social autopsy on Sodom. Chapter 16, verses 49 and 50. And pay close attention to the order of the words, because that order is everything. Behold, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom, pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness. She and her daughters had this. And they did not strengthen the hand of the poor and needy, and they were haughty, and committed abomination before me, and when I saw it, I took them away. Stop. Go back to that sequence, slowly. Pride, bread, idleness, indifference toward the poor, and then, only then, after all of that, comes the word abomination. There's an order, there's a progression, there's a path that took Sodom from being a prosperous metropolis of the Middle Bronze Age to becoming the eternal example of human depravity. And that path has 5 steps, 5 rungs descending downward. The first rung was pride. The Hebrew word is gaon, and it isn't the healthy pride of looking at your work and feeling good about it. It's the pride that makes you look at heaven and think you don't need anyone anymore. Sodom sat on a fertile plain. Harvests almost grew themselves. Commerce flowed. The metropolis grew. And the people began to believe all of that was their own doing. When a society forgets it received, it begins to believe it deserves. And when it begins to believe it deserves, it begins to justify whatever keeps it in its place. This is going to matter later. Remember this line? The second rung was what the Hebrew calls sivat lejem, fullness of bread, constant material abundance. It's not that they had food, it's that they had too much. The problem stopped being survival. Sodom reached that dangerous point where basic needs were covered, and then the heart began searching for something else to fill it. And that something else, without God, is always the same thing. More pleasure, more control, more experience, more of everything. If you've ever had a week where you earned more than you needed and suddenly found yourself buying things you didn't even want, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That was Sodom, at metropolitan scale, for decades. And here's something almost nobody preaches. Material abundance isn't a sin. God blessed Abraham with riches, blessed Joseph with power, blessed Solomon with prosperity. Abundance in itself doesn't destroy. What destroys is abundance disconnected from gratitude. What destroys is having much and forgetting where it came from. What destroys is eating until you're full and never asking who's going hungry 3 streets away. Sodom ate, but it had forgotten, and the human heart that forgets inevitably fills itself with itself. The third rung was idleness. Shalvat hashket, tranquil rest, the peace that doesn't give thanks. The rest that doesn't produce. When people have nothing pressing on them, they begin inventing fake urgencies, and fake urgencies are always about the body, about desire, about applause, about adventure. The great civilizations never fall while they're fighting. They fall while they're resting. If this makes you a little uncomfortable, wait. Because what comes next hits harder. The fourth rung is the one that stops me every time I come back to the text. And she did not strengthen the hand of the afflicted and the needy. Do you realize what God is saying here? The fourth step toward abomination wasn't a sexual act. It wasn't a violent crime. It wasn't a theological heresy. It was indifference. Sodom saw the poor man and kept walking, saw the hungry stranger and closed the door, saw the widow on the street and looked the other way, heard the cry and thought, not my problem. And here's the detail almost no preacher emphasizes. God places indifference toward the poor before sexual abomination on the list. Why? because indifference is the soil where abomination grows. A society that learns to feel nothing about the pain of others is already one step away from being able to do anything to others. Imagine the scene. Year after year, generation after generation, children growing up in Sodom watching their parents pass by beggars without seeing them. Adolescents learning that the stranger is an object. Adults hardening through 1,000 sideways glances. Do you know what happens to a human heart after 1,000 times of feeling nothing? It becomes stone, and a stone has no problem hurting another stone. There's a modern scene that captures this. 1964, New York. A woman is attacked on a street in the early hours. The reports afterward documented that multiple neighbors could hear the screams, and sociologists called it the bystander effect. The more witnesses there are, the less likely it is that anyone acts, because each one assumes someone else will do something, and so nobody does anything. Sodom was the bystander effect taken to metropolitan scale. For 4 straight centuries. And here's another scene, closer, more current. A person opens a phone over lunch in a downtown coffee shop. Outside, a homeless man is asking for change. The person sees through the window and chooses the filter on the screen, uploads a photo of the coffee, adds a motivational quote, closes the app, walks past the man without seeing him, without feeling anything, without their afternoon changing in the slightest. That's Sodom in everyday form. You don't have to commit any abomination to be on the road. It's enough to stop seeing the one who's suffering next to you. It's enough to train your heart not to respond. It's enough to normalize, there's nothing I can do. And here's the most disturbing part. That person isn't a monster. That person is probably someone who goes to church, who tithes, who knows verses. Sodom wasn't full of demons in disguise. It was full of ordinary people who slowly lost the ability to see the other as human. And then comes the 5th rung, and only then, after all the others. And they were haughty and committed abomination before me. The word is toba, and toba is a technical term in biblical Hebrew. It's not just something bad, it's something ritually repugnant. It's the word that appears in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22. Prohibiting specific sexual acts. It's the word used for idolatry and for human sacrifice. It's what crosses a line that must not be crossed. But here's a detail that changes everything. Toba doesn't appear only when we talk about Sodom. It appears more than 100 times in the Old Testament, and almost always, it's connected with a pattern. Toba never starts big. Toba starts small, in a corner, in a concession that seems minor, in a just this once. And from there it grows. Proverbs chapter 6 mentions 7 things that are Toba to God. And look at the order. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet swift in running to evil, a false witness who breathes out lies, and one who sows discord among brothers. Only one of the 7 has to do with physical violence. The other 6 have to do with the heart, with the word, with the gaze. Toba begins on the inside, long before it shows on the outside. And here, Ezekiel is connecting the dots for us. Sodom's Toba wasn't an accident. It wasn't an isolated group of criminals. It was the natural endpoint of a 4-century process. Pride, abundance, idleness, indifference, and then abomination. If these dots are connecting for you right now, hit like. Share with someone who needs to see this. It's the only way the algorithm lets me keep talking about these topics in depth. But there's a character in this story who almost stays inside, a man who lived in the middle of all this and who almost doesn't escape. Lot. Abraham's nephew. And here's something you have to understand. Lot didn't arrive in Sodom overnight. Lot arrived because when Abraham gave him the choice, he chose what looked best at first glance. Fertile land, water, commerce, the promise of fast prosperity. Genesis chapter 13, verse 11. Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan. Pause for a second on that choice, because there's a detail almost no one comments on. When Abraham offers Lot first pick, he's doing something culturally unthinkable. In the world of the ancient Near East, the patriarch, the elder, the head of the clan, always chose first. Always. It was unwritten law. But Abraham, the uncle, the patriarch, yields the right to his younger nephew, and Lot, instead of returning the gesture and letting Abraham choose, grabs the best without hesitating. Verse 10 says he lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of the Jordan. The Hebrew verb is nasa, to lift the eyes, to look with desire. It's the same verb Eve uses when she sees the forbidden tree. Lot's choice begins with the gaze. The decisions that destroy lives almost never look at the moment like decisions that destroy lives. They look smart, strategic, sensible. Lot's was that. A reasonable choice, looking at the data, looking at the map, looking at the returns. It was the obvious option. What Lot didn't calculate was the invisible cost. The cost of raising his daughters in a culture that would deform them. The cost of sleeping every night in a place whose zikar was reaching heaven. The cost of getting used to, without noticing, the way of thinking of the men he traded with every day. 4,000 years later, every time someone chooses an opportunity that looks good but pulls them away from where God placed them, they're repeating Lot's mistake. And almost nobody finds out until it's too late. And look at the progression the text records. Genesis 13 verse 10, Lot saw. Genesis 13 verse 12, Lot dwelt. Genesis 14 verse 12, Lot was living in Sodom. Genesis 19 verse 1, Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom. 4 stages, 4 descents, to look, to approach, to live, to govern. The sins that destroy us most don't enter through the front door. They enter through the gaze that lingered 1 second too long, and there was a warning in the middle. Because between Genesis 13 and Genesis 19, there's an episode almost everyone skips. The war of the 4 kings against the 5 kings in Genesis chapter 14. A coalition of Mesopotamian kings invades the region of Sodom, defeats its kings, plunders the metropolis, and takes captives. Among the captives, Lot. Abraham has to arm 318 of his servants, chase the invaders all the way to the region of Dan, recover the captives, and bring Lot back to Sodom. Verses 14 through 16. And here's the question any rational person would ask. Lot has just been kidnapped. He's just lost everything. His uncle fought a war to get him out of there. The signal from heaven was literal. What does Lot do? He goes back to Sodom, and this time, deeper than before. Chapter 19 finds him sitting at the gate, promoted, established, more committed to the place. There are people who receive clear warnings from God and read those warnings as bad luck. Lot is the classic case. God literally pulled him out of Sodom through war. And Lot interpreted the war as a logistical problem Abraham solved, not as a voice from heaven telling him to leave. That happens today too. Crisis after crisis. A person stays in the place that's destroying them because they read every crisis as a bump in the road, not as a message. Sitting at the gate in the world of the ancient Near East was the place of judges, of elders, of leaders. The cuneiform inscriptions of ancient Mesopotamia, found at sites like Mari and Nuzi, describe exactly this. The gate was the courthouse, the public office, the place of decisions. Lot, Abraham's nephew, after 4 chapters of spiritual descent, was now part of the establishment of Sodom, an authority, a respected citizen, someone who decided over others. And then, at sunset on an ordinary day, 2 visitors arrive. The account says it in short, almost spare phrases. Two men enter the place. Lot rises, welcomes them, insists they come into his house. The Hebrew verb in verse 3 is vayiftzar bam meod. He pressed upon them strongly. Why so much insistence? Because Lot knew. He knew exactly what happened in the streets of Sodom after dark. He knew that two foreigners, young, unprotected, in a public square, weren't going to survive the night. Maybe he had seen a lot. And maybe he had learned to say nothing, but this night is different. This night he brings them into his house. This night he tries to protect them. Imagine the scene. The dark wooden door closes. The bronze bolt drops with a dry thud. Inside, the light of the oil lamps. The smell of fresh-baked bread. Lot insisting they eat. His daughters perhaps peeking out from the other room. His wife preparing water for the visitors' feet, according to custom. For a moment, that house is an island of civilization inside a metropolis that no longer has any. And then, outside, the noise begins. Footsteps, many footsteps, voices calling to each other. Torches lighting up, neighbors warning neighbors. The news moves through the streets faster than the wind. Foreigners have arrived. They're at Lot's house. And what comes next is going to make you question everything you thought you knew about human depravity in its purest form. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, the entire population from the youngest to the oldest. Go back to the text, slowly. Every single man. The Hebrew text says, Kol ha-mikatze, every man from every corner. There's no isolated group, no organized criminal gang, no deviant minority. Verse 4 is describing the totality of the adult and young male population, marching together with a single purpose. This is what makes the episode unique in all of Scripture. We're not seeing some sinners, we're seeing an entire society where sin became the norm. Where behavior that in any other human culture would have been hidden, in Sodom was done in the open in groups, with public approval. That's the real definition of depravity, not the act, the normalization of the act. And then they shout. The voice isn't one. There are hundreds, there are thousands. It's a chorus rising from the street. Lot's door trembles, the hinges creak. Inside, the daughters press against a wall. Lot's wife looks at her husband with eyes full of panic. The two visitors, on the other hand, don't move. They don't look afraid. They just observe. Bring them out. We want to know them. That word again. Yada. To know. Scholars have argued for centuries about exactly what yada means in this verse. Let me give you the data point that closes the debate. Yada appears more than 940 times in the Old Testament. The vast majority of times it means to know, understand. But there are approximately 15 times when it means, with no ambiguity, to have sexual relations. One of those times is Genesis chapter 4, verse 1. Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. Another of those times is just 3 verses later in this same chapter, verse 8. Lot says, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. The same verb, yada, and nobody disputes what it means there. Some modern commentators have proposed that in verse 5, yada only means to question, to find out. But that interpretation collapses with one question. If the men of Sodom only wanted to question the visitors, why does Lot offer them his virgin daughters in substitution? The answer is obvious, because Lot understood perfectly what they wanted, and he answered with the currency he thought equivalent. What was happening that night at Lot's door was mass sexual violation in a group of defenseless foreigners by an entire society. That's what the text says. But there's something deeper. And this is the first real twist of the story. The visitors inside the house weren't ordinary men. They were angels, messengers from heaven, beings with supernatural power. Verse 11 tells us what happened next. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves trying to find the door. Stop here. The blind ones kept searching. The men of Sodom were struck with supernatural blindness. Their eyes stopped working, and instead of pulling back terrified, instead of fleeing, instead of repenting, they kept searching for the door, groping in the dark, to get in and rape Lot's visitors. Let it sink in. We're talking about men who have just been struck by a clearly supernatural manifestation of God's judgment. And their response isn't fear. It isn't to flee. It isn't to pull back. Their response is to keep searching for the way to commit the sin. That's what the Bible calls total depravity. It's not being bad. It's being so blind to evil that not even supernatural judgment can stop you. There's a technical word in Christian theology for this: hardening. The process by which a person, after rejecting truth many times, loses the capacity to recognize it. Hebrews chapter 3 verse 13 warns about it, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Sin, the author says, deceives, and the first deception is making you believe you'll be able to stop whenever you want, that you're in control, that this won't change you. The men of Sodom were once children. Once they had mothers who put them to bed. Once they had dreams. Once they felt disgust at certain things. And then, step by step, time after time, those internal limits got erased, until the night came when they were ready to rape 2 foreigners in front of all of Sodom. And even after the supernatural blindness, they kept searching for the door. When someone tells you, "This won't change me," remember Sodom. Remember that every man in that mob, at some point, said exactly the same thing. And there's the darkest data point. Blindness, in biblical language, is almost never just physical. Hebrews chapter 6 verse 4 warns about people who were enlightened and tasted the heavenly gift, and afterward fell away. The deep question of the biblical text isn't why people commit sins. The question is why some people, after seeing the light, prefer to close their eyes. The Sodomites saw the blindness fall on them. They saw the supernatural hand act, and their response was to feel the wall to reach the door. That image of a man feeling along the dark to reach the thing that's destroying him, is the perfect picture of the hardened heart. And that image, unfortunately, isn't exclusive to Sodom. It reappears every time a human being, knowing something is killing them, comes back anyway. One more time, one more time, one more time. Now we go to the most controversial detail of the chapter: Lot's offer. "I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men." What on earth is going on here? Lot, the man who 2 verses earlier was the only righteous one in Sodom, is really offering his 2 virgin daughters to be raped by a furious mob. There are 3 possible readings, and you need to know all 3. The first reading is the most ancient. Lot was applying, in a twisted version, the hospitality code of the ancient Near East. In that culture, receiving a visitor under your roof created a sacred obligation to protect him. The life of the guest stood above everything, even family, even daughters, even oneself. Lot, living under that code, preferred to sacrifice his own flesh and blood rather than break the sacred law of hospitality. This reading doesn't excuse Lot, but it contextualizes him, and it shows just how far Sodom's culture had distorted even its most righteous residents. The second reading is darker. Lot was already contaminated. 4 chapters living in Sodom had eroded his moral judgment. 2 of his daughters were married to men of the place, according to verse 14. His sons-in-law were Sodomites. His family was already mixed with the rot. And when the crisis came, Lot reacted the way the culture surrounding him reacted, negotiating with bodies, assigning differentiated value to human lives, treating his daughters as transferable property. This is the reading most modern exegetes defend, and it's devastating, because it means even the righteous man of Sodom wasn't really healthy. The third reading, proposed by some medieval rabbis, is that Lot was offering something he knew they wouldn't accept. A desperate bluff, a move to buy time. He knew the men of Sodom didn't want his daughters, they wanted the visitors. The offer was a distraction. If this is true, it still doesn't save Lot. Because even a bluff that puts the lives of your virgin daughters on the line already says a lot about who you've become. Whichever of the three readings you choose, the theological point is the same. Living among depravity deforms. You don't have to participate to be corrupted. It's enough to stay. It's enough to normalize. It's enough to sit at the gate and say nothing. 4,000 years later, that lesson is still true. And here's something almost no one stops to think about. The men of Sodom rejected Lot's daughters. Verse 9 is the mob's response. Stand back. And they said, this fellow came in to sojourn, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. Read that. He offered them young women, and they answered by saying, we'll do worse to you. This completely changes the reading. They weren't consumed only by sexual desire. They were consumed by domination, by humiliation, by the pleasure of breaking another human being. They wanted the visitors specifically because they were strangers, because they were vulnerable, because subduing them would be a public act of power. And when Lot steps in, they decide he too is going to pay. Why? Because he dared to pretend to be morally superior. He keeps acting as a judge. In Sodom, judging was the worst sin. Having morals was being seen as a threat. Sound familiar? A society reaches its lowest point not when everyone sins. It reaches its lowest point when anyone who suggests something is sinful becomes the real enemy. When the problem stops being evil and becomes whoever points at evil. Lot, in that moment, was a second away from being raped and killed by his own people for suggesting that maybe what they were about to do wasn't right. And that's when the angels intervene. They pull Lot inside, close the door, and blind the entire mob. Hold on a second, because we have to talk about something almost every sermon avoids. The angels already had the sentence written before they arrived. Verse 13. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against them has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. This means one thing. What happened that night at Lot's door wasn't what triggered the destruction. The destruction had already been decided. What happened that night was the public confirmation of what heaven already knew. That's why there were two angels, two witnesses. The principle that would later be codified in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15, was already operating in divine logic. God didn't destroy Sodom on the basis of a single report. He sent two official witnesses from heaven to see with their own eyes what was happening on the streets. And Sodom, by surrounding Lot's house, by demanding to rape the visitors, by rejecting the daughters, by ignoring the supernatural blindness, by insisting even after the miracle, gave those two witnesses all the evidence they needed. Sodom signed its own sentence that night. But the paper had been ready for some time. If this blew your mind as much as it blew mine when I understood it, drop a like now. Share with someone who needs to hear it. The modern church avoids these texts. The algorithm punishes me for talking about them. But your like tells the system this matters. And that's why you're still watching this video. And there's still what almost no one preaches. Dawn comes, and Lot is still inside. Verse 16 is one of the most moving in the Old Testament and almost never preached. And while he lingered, the men seized his hand, and the hand of his wife, and the hands of his two daughters, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. Stop. Lot stayed standing. After everything he saw, after the attempted mass rape, after the supernatural blindness, after the explicit announcement that the place was going to be destroyed within hours, Lot stayed standing. Why? The Hebrew verb is vayit machma. It means he lingered, he hesitated, he stayed. The ancient rabbis use it to describe someone whose body is in one place but whose heart is in another. Lot was physically ready to leave, but something inside him was glued to the ground of Sodom. His possessions were there, his contacts, his social identity, the gate where he sat, the position, the status. 4 chapters of emotional investment, 4 chapters of "this is my place now." And the angels had to take him by the hands, physically, him, his wife, his 2 daughters, and drag them out by force. There's something terrifying about that. There are people God literally has to tear out of the situations that are about to kill them, because they, on their own, can't leave. They stayed so long they got confused with the place. And that gesture, that supernatural gesture, grabbing a paralyzed human hand and dragging it outside, is the most exact definition of grace that exists in all of the Old Testament. But there's one more detail, and this detail makes the scene almost unbearable to read. Verse 16 ends with 5 Hebrew words almost every translation softens. Bejemlat Adonai alav, in the mercy of the Lord upon him. Lot wasn't taken out because he was good. He wasn't taken out because he deserved it. He wasn't taken out because he made the right decision in time. He was taken out because God had mercy. And the mercy, in this case, took the form of a hand that took another hand and dragged it by force out of the impact zone. And if you want to know why Lot was rescued and others weren't, the answer isn't in Lot. The answer is in something that happened 2 chapters earlier, Genesis chapter 18, verse 23. Abraham, standing before the Lord, interceding. Will you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? And Abraham brought the number down. From 50 to 45, from 45 to 40, from 40 to 30, from 30 to 20, from 20 to 10. 10 righteous, and Sodom was saved. There weren't 10. But Abraham's prayer, that prayer that seemed not to work, that prayer that ended with an anguished Abraham looking toward the columns of smoke in the distance, that prayer saved Lot. Genesis chapter 19, verse 29. And God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the destruction. Look at that phrase. God remembered Abraham. It doesn't say God remembered Lot. It says remembered Abraham. Lot wasn't rescued because of his merits. Lot was rescued because someone standing before the Lord had interceded for him. Think about that for a second. Think about how many people right now are alive because someone somewhere is praying for them. Your name could be on someone's prayer list, someone you don't even know. And that prayer could be exactly what's keeping you on your feet when you think you're walking alone. There are mothers who prayed 30 years for sons who don't even know they prayed. There are wives who hold marriages together with bent knees while their husbands believe it's just luck. There are pastors who carry entire churches in silent prayer. Intercession is the most invisible and most powerful mechanism of God's kingdom. And Sodom, the story of Sodom, records it explicitly. Lot didn't deserve to come out, but someone prayed, and that was enough. Escape for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stop anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountain, lest you be consumed. That's the order, clear, direct, without ambiguity. And then what happens, happens. Verse 24. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of the heavens. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. The Hebrew word for brimstone is gophrit, and the word for fire is esh. Picture the moment. Dawn is ending. The sun rises over the mountains of Gilead to the east. The light of dawn lights up the houses of Sodom still asleep. Most don't know what happened the night before at Lot's house. Most don't know that 2 beings from heaven decided, based on what they saw, that the metropolis had reached its end. The birds sing. The ovens start firing for breakfast, doors open, the daily life of an ordinary day is beginning. And then, without warning, the sky changes. This is where archaeology has something to say, and this is the moment I promised in minute 22. In the year 2021, a team of geologists led by researchers from Northern Arizona University with scientists from the University of California at Santa Barbara, Elizabeth City State University, and other institutions published a study in Scientific Reports, a journal of the Nature Group. The study analyzed the remains found at el-Hammam, an archaeological site located about 14 kilometers northeast of the Dead Sea in the Jordan Valley. What they found shook the world. Layers of destruction showing evidence of extreme heat, pottery fragments melted on the outside but intact on the inside, indicating temperatures above 2,000 degrees Celsius for extremely short periods. Abnormally high concentrations of salts and sulfates in the soil. Tiny crystalline structures called diamonoids, which only form under pressures and temperatures equivalent to a cosmic impact. Tiny spheres of molten iron, shocked quartz, transformed minerals that in nature are only found in meteor craters or at nuclear test sites. Their conclusion was that some kind of cosmic event, possibly a comet or asteroid exploding in the atmosphere at low altitude, devastated the place around the year 1650 before Christ. The combined region of the Jordan Valley housed at that time approximately 50,000 people distributed across 3 cities, with tall el-Hammam being the largest. Picture the scene: an ordinary morning, merchants opening stalls, mothers calling the kids, fired up ovens, and then without warning a flash in the sky, brighter than 1,000 suns. A heat wave that in less than a second raises temperatures to levels that melt metal. A pressure wave that follows the flash, traveling at supersonic speed. Buildings collapsing like houses of cards, tens of thousands of people, erased in half a minute. I want to be honest with you. That study was challenged. In the year 2022, other scientists published a response also in Scientific Reports, arguing there was no conclusive mineralogical or geochemical evidence of a cosmic impact. The journal issued corrections to the original article. The identification of tall el-Hammam with Sodom remains debated in academic circles. The archaeologist Stephen Collins, who led excavations at the site for more than 15 years, defends the identification. Other archaeologists, like those who excavated Bab Edra, south of the Dead Sea, propose a different site, with earlier destruction around the year 2350 before Christ. What is not in debate is this: there was massive destruction in the Dead Sea region during the Middle Bronze Age. The area was abandoned for centuries after that event. The collective memory of the Canaanite peoples preserved the story of a catastrophe in that zone, and the biblical text, written centuries later, describes exactly that. Brimstone, fire, an entire plain consumed, and then centuries of depopulation. Archaeology doesn't prove the Bible. But archaeology doesn't contradict it either. And in this particular case, it seems to whisper the same thing. If you want us to keep digging into these topics, drop your like now. Every like tells the system it's worth producing content with real research and not recycled content. And then, the image. Lot's wife looks back, and she's turned into a pillar of salt. Almost every sermon stops at the obvious. Looking back symbolizes the heart attached to the past. True, but there are deeper layers. The Hebrew verb in verse 26 is vatabet. It's not just she looked. It's she looked with longing. It's the same root that appears when God tells Abraham, look to the heavens and count the stars. It's a loaded gaze, a gaze with the soul inside. Lot's wife wasn't being curious. She was being nostalgic. And what she was feeling nostalgia for was the metropolis God was burning, the place of the abomination, the place of the 4 centuries of descent, the place where her daughters grew up, yes, but also the place whose culture she had absorbed without noticing. There are people God takes out of a place, but the place doesn't leave them. Salt in the biblical context has a double meaning. On one hand, it was a symbol of covenant and preservation. But on the other hand, in passages like Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 23, salt and brimstone are the marks of the curse upon the earth. Salt, in excess, destroys crops, makes the soil sterile, puts a permanent mark on the ground. Lot's wife was turned into what she, in her heart, already was: a statue, immobile, sterile, a permanent mark of the judgment. And Lot keeps walking, with his 2 daughters, toward the cave. If you've made it this far, this was the moment I told you about at the beginning. Here it comes. Lot ends up in a cave, alone, with his 2 daughters, no wife, no sons-in-law, no possessions, no metropolis, no anything. I'm not going to tell you the full scene that follows, because we already did an entire video on that on the channel. What you need to know for this story is just the point. The 2 daughters, that night and the next, get their father drunk and conceive children with him, verses 31 through 38. From there are born Moab and Ammon, 2 peoples that for centuries will be enemies of Israel. But the important question isn't what they did. The important question is where they learned that this was a viable solution. The answer is Sodom. Those 2 young women grew up there. They saw fathers who sold their daughters. They saw men who negotiated bodies. They saw a society where sex had been completely disconnected from love, from respect, from human dignity. They learned that the body is a tool. They learned that the will of the other doesn't matter when there's a reasonable goal behind it. They learned what their environment taught, and when they came out of Sodom, Sodom came with them, in their minds, in their reflexes, in their way of solving problems. Lot thought he had saved his daughters by getting them out. He didn't save them. The culture was already inside them. And this is the insight almost no other channel is going to give you. The most dangerous thing about Sodom wasn't the rain of fire. The most dangerous thing was the culture that crept into hearts without anyone noticing. A girl growing up seeing certain things as normal, an adolescent forming in an environment without restraint, an adult who can no longer tell what's right from what's simply customary. There are parents today living exactly this. Parents who spend 50 hours a week working to give the best to their children. And while they work, the children are learning from screens and from peers what's worth and what isn't. When the parents get home, exhausted, satisfied at having provided, they find children who no longer think like them, who no longer believe like them, who no longer see the world like them. And the parents, just like Lot, believe that because they're under their roof, their children are safe, that because they gave them shelter, they gave them safety. But real formation isn't given by the roof, it's given by the culture. And the culture enters through the algorithms, through friends, through teachers, through songs, through screens. While the parents are out earning the bread, someone else is inside forming the hearts. Lot's 2 daughters are a silent warning for every generation. You can take yourself out of Sodom, but getting Sodom out of someone who grew up inside it is another story. Now we go to the final twist. The twist that recontextualizes absolutely everything we've just seen. Jesus spoke about Sodom, Matthew chapter 11, verse 23. Jesus speaks to Capernaum, a town in Galilee, where he had performed most of his miracles. And he says something chilling. And you, Capernaum, who are exalted to heaven, will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. Listen to that phrase carefully. Jesus is saying that Sodom, the Sodom of Genesis, if it had seen the miracles Capernaum saw, would have repented. And not only would it have repented, it would have survived. until the days of Jesus. Do you know what this implies? It implies that Capernaum, in terms of spiritual responsibility, was worse than Sodom. It implies that seeing light and rejecting it is more serious than being in darkness and never having seen it. And that applies to something deeper. Sodom was destroyed by a tobar that grew out of a long process. But the towns that see Christ and remain indifferent, the people who hear the gospel and go on as if nothing happened, the generations that have access to the truth and choose to ignore it, those are judged with a stricter measure. You and I are in that category. You and I, who are watching this video, who heard the word, who have access to Bibles in 5 languages, who saw archaeologists confirm what the text says, who know the arguments, who heard the sermons. If we ignore what we know, if we treat the truth as internet content, if we let the word go in one ear and out the other while our lives go on exactly the same, we're going to be judged with the same measure as Capernaum. And that measure is stricter than the one that fell on Sodom. That phrase of Jesus, almost nobody quotes it, almost nobody teaches it, but it's there. Matthew chapter 11, Luke chapter 10. Repeated by 2 evangelists. The most accountable generation before God isn't the one that sinned the most. It's the one that saw the most light and chose to live as if it hadn't seen it. Sodom was destroyed by its active ignorance, by choosing the darkness without ever fully knowing the light. Capernaum was warned because it knew the light, saw miracles, heard the Son of God himself teach in its streets, and decided to go on the same. Decided it was more comfortable not to fully believe, decided the miracles were interesting but not transforming. Decided Jesus was a good teacher but not necessarily Lord. And that's why Jesus said it would be brought down to Hades. And here's a fact that puts this on another level. Capernaum today doesn't exist. The metropolis that in the 1st century was prosperous, commercial, full of fishermen and Roman soldiers, today is an archaeological site. Ruins, numbered stones, tourists with cameras. The synagogue where Jesus taught is buried under a later synagogue. Peter's house is marked with a glass disc so people can see it without stepping on it. The metropolis that saw more miracles than any other is, today, archaeological dust. Sodom disappeared in one night. Capernaum disappeared over centuries. But both disappeared, and Jesus had announced it. Do you see the inversion? The culture we assume to be Christian, the generation that grew up in countries with churches, that had Bibles in their homes, that heard the gospel 1,000 times. That generation doesn't have Sodom's excuse. That generation has Capernaum's responsibility, and that should make us tremble much more than we tremble. There's a text that closes everything. Revelation chapter 11, verse 8. The prophet John describes a final metropolis, an eschatological city where God's 2 witnesses will be killed. And that place receives a symbolic name, the great city which spiritually is called Sodom. Sodom isn't just an ancient place. It's an archetype. It's what any human society becomes when it completes the 5 steps Ezekiel listed. Pride, abundance, idleness, indifference, abomination. Any society, any nation, any culture, any community, any home, if it walks those 5 steps, it becomes Sodom, no matter the era, no matter the language, no matter the place. And that's the question the text asks you 4,000 years later. Which step are you on? What's the step of your house, of your job, of your screen, of your generation? Because the rain of fire isn't only physical. It begins long before. It begins the day a heart stops knowing that something is wrong. The account in Genesis 19 isn't a story about what happened 4,000 years ago near the Dead Sea. It's a mirror, and every generation that reads it sees itself reflected at some point in the descent. The question isn't whether today's culture resembles Sodom. The question is which point of the road we're at, and the answer, that answer, depends on what you do with what you just heard. Lot had two daughters who were already shaped by their environment before the environment fell. Lot's wife had her heart in the metropolis even when her body was already outside. The men of Sodom kept searching for the door even after going blind. 3 different ways of not escaping, 3 different ways of staying, and only one way out. The angels took Lot by the hand and dragged him out by force. That scene of the supernatural hand grabbing a paralyzed human hand and dragging it outside, is Christ on the cross 2,000 years later. It's the grace that arrives when willpower no longer reaches. It's the divine force entering human history to pull out of the rain of fire those who can no longer pull themselves out. And that hand is still extended. Today, now, if you're reading this text, if you're listening to this video, if you made it this far, it's because that hand is still extended toward you. The question is whether you're going to take it, or whether you're going to stand still, like Lot that morning, looking toward the things that are already condemned. If this touched something inside you, don't keep it to yourself. If you just got here and you're new around here, no pressure at all. Take your time, decide for yourself if the channel adds to your life. And only then think about subscribing. Wait, watch a few more, see if it really helps you. There's no rush. But if you're already family, if you've been with this channel a while, you already know what helps us keep going. A like at this point isn't a small thing. It's what tells the algorithm these topics are worth pushing further. If this added something to you today, drop the like, share with someone who needs to see this. And if it didn't, that's fine too, nothing forced. There's another video on screen, one that connects directly with what we just saw, and I think you're ready to watch it.